Hello, I'm Yoram Hazony, and this is NatConTalk, where nationalism and conservatism meet. If you are enjoying our videos, you can help us out by hitting the like button and subscribing to this channel. Before we start the episode, I am pleased to announce that registration is now open for NatCon 2, the National Conservatism Conference in Orlando, Florida, in just a few weeks. Our guest today, Michael Knowles, will be there alongside dozens of other fabulous speakers. Make sure to sign up to come to the conference at nationalconservatism.org. Check out the link in the description of the video. As you already know, Michael is a popular talk show host at the Daily Wire, and he's the author of the new book, Speechless: Controlling Words, Controlling Minds. Michael Knowles, welcome to NatConTalk.
Well, thank you for having me. It is a true pleasure to be with you.
It's really wonderful to have you on, Michael, and I'm very excited about your new book, Speechless. I want to kick off by reading an important passage from your book. You write as follows: "Political correctness did not begin as a crusade for civility. It began as a political campaign to upend Western society. Its instigators viewed our culture as unjust and oppressive, and they undertook to remake the culture by forbidding traditional perspectives and enforcing the fashionable views of leftist ideologues. The new standard took the name of political correctness, which was a variation on an earlier communist slogan." Now, I know that a lot of our friends are kind of scared to say that this woke movement that's taken over in America, that it really is Marxism. But they say, oh, no, don't say that. Don't say it's Marxism. But you do say it. You go ahead and you say it. Why do you say that wokeism is Marxism?
I share the reticence of some of our conservative intellectual friends because the moment that you evoke the M word, people call you a crazy conspiracy theorist. They sort of make fun of you. And now, actually, a lot of the gatekeepers of information have edited pages like Wikipedia and elsewhere to suggest that any invocation of Marxism in these intellectual movements is a conspiracy theory and it's all crazy. And I recognize that Karl Marx is not to blame for every terrible thing in the world. But he is to blame for a lot of bad things. I'm reminded of Whittaker Chambers, the ex-communist, who said that Marxism is not the newest ideology in the world. It's actually the second oldest. It's the great alternative faith of mankind that begins in the Garden of Eden when the serpent tells Eve, "Ye shall be as gods." And it is simply a fact of history that the thinkers who developed what became political correctness were either outright members of the Communist Party or overt self-styled Marxist intellectuals or Marxist student radicals who were reading these writings. And one need only rattle off some of the names. Antonio Gramsci, the major mind in Western Marxism, founder of the Italian Communist Party, a very important theorist on these questions of cultural hegemony, on wars of position, on education. Then you get, of course, to the Frankfurt School thinkers, who were not just some random little subset of Marxist, who also, by the way, overtly Marxist, and originally the school was called the Institute for Marxism. But later on, one of them, Herbert Marcuse, becomes the father of the New Left, major student movement, which takes on and develops these ideas of political correctness directly through the importation of the writings of Mao Zedong, a communist dictator in China. This develops further in the 1970s through Marxists, and the 1980s through Marxists in the academy. And now we see organizations such as Black Lives Matter, the fruit of these movements, which was founded by self-described Marxists. And so, yes, there are other intellectual movements that play a role here, but to deny the influence of Marxism on this is preposterous. The very phrase political correctness is a phrase that comes from the Communist Party. And so I understand that people don't want to be called a kook or a conspiracy theorist, but we can't deny what is plainly before our eyes for more than a century.
Right. So the history, I think the history is convincing. I mean, I just believe it. I think you did a great job with it. But does it also teach us something? I mean, is there, besides, so I've successfully traced the history. If somebody says to you, okay, but what difference does it make? Why does it help us to know that these people are Marxists? What does that tell us?
Well, I think of all the many wild and crazy things that Karl Marx ever said and declared, one of them holds the key to understanding what political correctness is. And it's in a letter to Arnold Ruge, and he calls for the ruthless criticism of all that exists. And you see this obviously is developed with the critical theorists. Today we talk about critical race theory. It's very much in the news, and that's a derivation of critical theory. And in the words of Martin Jay, who's a sympathetic historian to the critical theorists, the brilliance of critical theory is that it's not exactly its own academic system. It's more a gadfly on other systems. The theory, once you get past all the pretentious jargon, is pretty simple. It's to criticize. It's to tear down all of the institutions and the edifices, and importantly, the standards of our civilization, to recreate the world anew. And I think this is the crux of the conservative misunderstanding of what political correctness is. To hear many conservatives talk about political correctness today, they believe it's a battle between free speech on the one hand and censorship on the other hand. And I don't think it's exactly that, and the people who developed it did not consider it to be that. They consider it, and I consider it to be, a battle between competing sets of standards. And all societies are going to have some things that are on limits and some things that are off limits. And they're going to have taboos, and they're going to have standards, and they're going to have systems of propriety. And so the question is, what do we consider to be taboo? What do we consider to be worthy of ostracism or cancel culture? You know, in the 1950s, you would be canceled for being a communist. Today, you will be canceled for not being a communist. The fact of cancel culture has not changed. It's the standard by which one can be canceled.
Okay, so let's say that I'm, one of your liberal admirers, and I'm listening to you saying, well, hey, if there are standards for canceling on the left, and then they're mirrored by standards, for canceling on the right, then you conservatives, you're just as bad as, the Marxists. Why should I side with you?
Well, what my wonderful hypothetical liberal admirer is saying here, I'm not sure if there's in practice a liberal admirer, but I hope that there is. What the liberal admirer is observing is that there is a similarity in the formal aspect of what the left and the right are doing. There's a similarity in the fact that they are enforcing and recognizing a set of standards and taboos. But form isn't everything. Procedure isn't everything. There is also substance. So the reasons for which one might ostracize someone or might discourage certain speech or might encourage other speech can be quite different. If I expel you from my government because you're a communist who wants to institute a rigorous system of atheism and the destruction of private property, and I expel you from my government, on the other hand, because you're a Christian who defends private property rights and supports the Western civilization and the very ideas that animate the country, I guess I'm expelling you in both cases. But the reasons for which I am doing that, the standards that I'm holding, are radically different. And every society must believe something. We have to have certain animating principles and values beneath our society. And the fact that we have those values matters, but what the values actually are matter as well.
Well, you've heard this, though. You know that there are plenty of people in, even among our close friends who think, sure, there are American values. Those values are, freedom, individual liberty, a rule of law, right, democracy, and rights, human rights. So they'll say, okay, that's my tradition. They'll say, in fact, I'm a conservative because I'm conserving liberalism. I'm a conservative because I'm conserving freedom. Don't tell me you don't get that all the time.
I hear this all the time, and the person that I defer to, I don't usually defer to John Locke, the father of liberalism, but when people raise this objection to me, I do defer to John Locke, because even John Locke, even the founder of liberalism, in his letter concerning toleration, acknowledges that there must be some limits. In the letter concerning toleration, he says we need to tolerate everybody and all views in society, except for atheism. Or you turn to John Milton, another very important liberal, wrote Areopagitica. It's probably the most famous defense of free speech in the English language. And in Areopagitica, what does he say? He says, we must have free speech for everybody, except for the Catholics. And I'm pleased that we've gotten rid of that bit of censorship, because otherwise I couldn't have written my book. But I understand the arguments he was making, and I recognize the political order that he was trying to defend after wars of religion had roiled the country for a very long time. Even the fathers of liberalism recognized is that liberty requires limits. And I think today, when you hear many of our friends on the right will say, gosh darn it, I'm an American, and I should be able to say and do whatever I want at any given time. And if I want to download terabytes of pornography and poison myself with pounds of drugs, why, gosh darn it, that's the most American thing I can imagine. And I think that concept of liberty would be foreign certainly to the founding fathers, and certainly to the great statesmen of history, and to basically everyone who in any way considered themselves a conservative until about 5 minutes ago. And Lord Acton, actually, to invoke another person admired by libertarians, Lord Acton points out that though the modern concept of liberty is that it's the ability to do whatever you want whenever you want to do it, actually true liberty is in the right to do what you ought to do. A true liberty is tamping down your basest appetites and passions and desires, bringing them into accord with your rational will. This was once understood to be the purpose of liberal education, to have you make sense of your liberty so that you could govern yourself in an appropriate way. This is what John Adams is talking about. There's that very famous line when he says the Constitution is built for a moral and religious people. This is not just superstition and Bible thumping. John Adams was not known for his Bible thumping. He's observing a fact about self-government, which is that if you cannot govern yourself, if you cannot impose limits on yourself, then you are not capable of true liberty. And so I think the conflation of liberty and licentiousness, not just on the left, but even on the right in recent decades, has been catastrophic. It's almost fatal to any semblance of conservatism in the country.
So if I understand what you're saying, there actually is a substantive difference between Marxist and revolutionary ideas, which are devoted to the ruthless criticism of everything that exists, and conservative ideas. I mean, you know, when I was in school, when I went to the school in the United States, people were always talking about learning critical thinking. And nobody ever talked about constructive thinking. Right? Yeah. I mean, the idea was that you should be free to criticize everything, because that was assumed to be, crucial in finding, your own beliefs and personal integrity. I don't have a big problem with that at all. But the idea that you then need to exercise your thinking in order to figure out how to build anything, how to preserve anything, how to keep anything going, that was always just left out. It was like, you're good at critical thinking. That's good. You can ruthlessly criticize. So we're done. And the question now is, I mean, pretty much everybody on the American right and a lot of people on the European right as well have been raised on this idea that when you go to school, you learn how to do critical thinking. You don't have any responsibility for constructing anything. And then people come along and they say, well, look, conservatives aren't worth anything. You can't conserve anything. Look, you haven't conserved anything. And, what actually have you conserved in the last 75 years? So what do you have to say about present day conservatism?
Well, it is no surprise that we haven't conserved anything. I think the most common activity that the American conservatives engage in, even the conservatives, is debunking. Right? We're in a culture of debunking and deconstruction and critical thinking and tearing everything down to its lowest level. I think that there is this idea, it's a sort of progressive idea, that the past was awful and the present is a crisis and the future is going to be wonderful, but we gotta keep pushing, fellas. That idea has infected the right as well. And I think there is an idea that all of the things that we consider to be good and true and beautiful, they're just an illusion. They're just a sort of social construction. And maybe this owes to the very destructive movements that overtook the academy in the 1960s and 1970s that a lot of conservatives have imbibed as well. And maybe it's just because we don't even we conservatives don't really believe what we say we should believe. Maybe even if we say that, yes, it would be good to go to church, but we don't actually go to church. If we say that it would be good to get married and raise a family, but we don't actually do any of that. We don't actually embody that because even we have adopted a kind of nihilistic idea about the culture, that it's all just sort of a construction. But it's not. Our forebears understood that there are some things that are good and some things that are true and some things are beautiful, and we actually can know something about them, and we can pursue those things, and we can build upon them, and we ought to preserve them. And it's much easier to destroy than it is to build. And so we've got to be very cautious here when we tear things down to their bottommost level, because we are called upon to do things. And unfortunately, I think that conservatives have lost that sense even of purpose and objective reality, especially in a world where the Smithsonian Institution tells us that reason and objective reality are just bywords for white supremacy and patriarchy.
I think I meet lots of young conservative people who are hotshots in tremendously sharp intellectually and knowledgeable and they know the conservative lingo. They know about the little platoons and the mediating institutions and all those kinds of things. They don't feel some kind of tremendous pressure to get married, to have children, to fight it out so that your marriage doesn't end in divorce, but instead stays together. I feel like the drive is all in the direction of, or most of it in the direction of personal success,
Yeah.
of achieving an impact through your words, your writing, your job. You're joining the administration. You're working at a think tank, radio, television, whatever it is, and conservative slogans, but they live the life of a liberal. They live this kind of life of pure free choice.
Yeah. There's a bit of an irony here because, and I say this as someone who was born and lived most of my life on the coasts, and I went to one of these elite universities, and so I've been in that environment for a very long time. But there is an irony that very often people who even recognize that perhaps it would be good to raise a family, it would be good to go to church, it would be good to be involved in your local community and to be invested in the future of your country. Very often they believe that that's for someone else to do. They will still go to the very liberal university, they will still go get a job at some multinational monstrous corporation or some investment bank or consulting firm, or they will live in the city and not even think of getting married until they're 40. And they just think that all those rules, that they sound good in theory, but it's just not for them. They have too much to offer the world. And it's too bad, because if conservative leaders won't embody and enact the virtues and practice the habits and virtues that they, at least in theory, think are good for society, then no one else is going to do it either. I mean, if even the people who have appointed themselves the leaders in this regard can't do it, how should they expect any of their countrymen to?
I remember in the 80s when there was this sort of older generation of conservatives who were conservative writers, thinkers, public figures who were associated with the Reagan movement. And I know today people think, Reagan, Thatcher, they were libertarians. They didn't believe in nationalism and religion. But those of us who were actually living at the time experienced it as a great moment of national and religious renewal on the campus where Yael and I were. People, Catholics, Jews, Protestants were becoming religious and did associate that kind of personal repentance and return to the tradition as an integral part of being conservative. But when I think about it now, I can definitely see that there were Christian leaders like Jerry Falwell or Billy Graham who were part of the Reagan moment, and they were obviously openly advocating for religion religion and nationalism. But quite a few of the, of my own intellectual mentors were definitely people who were, just like you're saying, they were pro-religion.
Yeah.
They would say, I am at the level of ideas, I'm orthodox, or I'm orthodox in principle.
Yeah.
And if you ask them, why, why don't you just, pick up religious practice? It would be very meaningful for people, for the rest of us who are, learning from you. And I think that they really felt like it didn't make much difference, because they believed in those days that we were on the verge of this huge religious nationalist revival. They thought that they were seeing just the beginning of it.
Yeah.
In other words, they would say things like, look, religious Christians and Jews have overwhelming demographic advantage over the non-religious, and liberalism as a system of ideas is, it's collapsing anyway. And what's shocking to go back and remember those days is they were 100% right about liberalism collapsing. I mean, they were dead on. That's exactly what happened. Here it is a generation later, and liberalism is turned into Marxism.
Yeah.
But they were right about that. But these Catholics and Protestants and Jews are completely under siege at this point. The demographic revolution never happened. All of us feel like, I think it, certainly in our community, I assume in yours, we feel like we're actually much weaker than we were a generation ago in a lot of ways.
Well, of course.
Is that...
What you're seeing now, I mean, I actually think this ties into one of these silly debates that cropped up on the right. Shows you how desiccated what passed for conservative thought had really become over the past 20 years, which is when an erstwhile conservative writer, now he's sort of more liberal, like openly liberal, David French, came out and defended Drag Queen Story Hour as one of the blessings of liberty. And James Madison is rolling in his grave at the very thought of that idea. But he was, to be as charitable as I can be to his point of view, he was suggesting that if we tell perverts that they can't twerk for little children at the public library, why then the left might tell us that we can't go to church on Sunday or we can't go to synagogue. And just as a practical matter, they're already doing that. The governor and mayor of New York threatened to permanently close synagogues if Jews wouldn't stop showing up during COVID. Many churches have been closed for months and months, better part of a year during the coronavirus lockdown in the United States, because the state religion, the religion of progressivism and public health, decided that it was going to wield power over the traditional religion of our country and our civilization. And that, I suppose what also comes from that, and what David French was talking to, was this radical skepticism, this idea that you couldn't tell the difference between a pervert jiggling for a kid and a pastor preaching the gospel. We just can't know which is better, which is worse, which man is speaking some truth, which is speaking falsehood. And if we really can't know that, if we can know nothing, then what we are surrendering our faculties of reason and our moral conscience, which are prerequisites for self-government. But you certainly have seen that happen. I mean, now even many practicing religious people will say, well, my religion, it's a private affair. My views of God are right and wrong and true and false. That's a private affair, and I would never seek to impose it on you or anyone else in my society.
Right. That's so true. The first line of defense is always, well, who's to decide? Who's to say?
Yeah.
And you want to say, well, what do you mean, who's to say? I mean, we live in a democracy, so we had this idea that that the public would say, but that we're able to decide, that we that we're smart enough to figure things out, or if not, at least that we had inherited some traditions that would make sense. But who's to say it's kind of like this. it's like a nihilist atomic bomb.
It's
like, you're saying that we should, Irving Kristol, let's say, wrote this famous essay about censoring pornography in the early 70s, in which he says explicitly that, if a state isn't, if a state and a society are not capable of censoring pornography, they're not capable of keeping people from behaving in the most debased and depraved fashion in public, then that society doesn't deserve self-government. That's literally the old conservatism. And now the answer is, well, who is going to decide that?
There are very few prominent conservatives, certainly in America, who are calling to regulate or ban pornography because they have bought this line that this kind of licentiousness is a blessing of liberty, for instance. But this ties into another one of these crazy slogans closely related to who decides, which I cannot believe that conservatives ever adopted this one. They'll say, you can't legislate morality. I don't even know what that means. I can't even quite say what they're getting at when they say you can't legislate morality, when all law, by definition, seeks to legislate morality. But it does legislate morality.
They think that there's such a thing as a neutral state, that the state can be neutral among, every possible substantive end that you can come up with. The state can be neutral with respect to it. I mean, the problem, of course, is that there never has been a neutral state in the history of the world, and that America, for example, or Britain in the last 3 generations, in attempting to reach that ideal of the neutral state, they've just gutted all the guidelines, all the guardrails, and overthrown everything. And it's not like, it's not like liberalism is what is left.
Well, of course, I mean, this is, I think, how they won the gay marriage debate, such as it did. There never was any debate, but it seems to me that if one were to redefine marriage, and they wanted to redefine marriage to include monogamous same-sex unions, then the question at issue would be, what is marriage? Everywhere for all of human history, people had this idea that sexual difference had something to do with marriage. Now you have this proposal that sexual difference has nothing to do with marriage. Okay, what's your evidence? They never presented any evidence. They never made any arguments. They just begged the question. They assumed their own conclusion, and they said, look, we know that sexual difference has nothing to do with marriage. The question is, who has the right to get married? And many conservatives many self-styled conservatives adopted this argument. They said, look, we have this restrictive view of marriage now, but we can have a more open, a more inclusive, a more neutral view of marriage, that it's just the bond of two people. And we'll just leave it up to, initially it was we'll leave it up to the states, and then that didn't last very long. And so now we have enshrined a new definition of marriage. I don't think it's any more neutral than the previous definition of marriage. I think it's just different, and it's more advantageous to the left.
Right, exactly. And so that's where we are. We're in the midst of the ruthless criticism of everything that has existed until now. We don't have very clear, it's not like we have a clear roadmap of where the left wants to take this. I mean, as you said before, I mean, they basically want to destroy whatever it is that we've had. Where do you think that we should be going? You talk every day. You're speaking into to a large audience of conservative young people. Where do we need to go from here? I mean, I won't pretend that things look good. I mean, I think that the last 2 years of new Marxist revolution taking over all the major institutions, really, in almost all the major institutions in the English-speaking world, and now it's spreading to Europe. We're getting it here in Israel, and it's going to get everywhere. And this is not, we really haven't seen something like this before. The old liberalism that after World War II controlled everything, it's completely on the ropes.
Yeah.
And, so where do you see conservatism going?
Well, there have been lots of different proposals for how to bring a little substance back to conservatism, which I think it's worth remembering too. Even after World War II, you've got the foundation of the post-war conservative movement. William F. Buckley Jr., who's widely credited as the founder of that movement, made very substantive claims. He was a defender of McCarthyism. He was a defender of anti-communism. He called himself an epistemological optimist. He said we can know certain things. We can exclude the Nazi from teaching sociology at Yale. We can exclude the communist from our government. We can know things, and we can put forth a positive vision for society. And then somewhere in the last few decades, that disappeared somehow. So the proposals that we're seeing really run the gamut. There has been a growth in the movement for Catholic integralism, for instance, at least online. I don't know if there's a ton of growth for that at the grassroots level. You're seeing, the Taliban taking over Afghanistan. I guess that's a substantive movement. They're making certain positive claims. I don't think it would be very popular here in the United States. So what can we do? Is that it? Are we just the American Taliban, as the left calls us? I don't think so. I think actually Edmund Burke offers a little glimpse into one way we can grab hold of some substance again. And it's with, I think, the most discarded of the virtues, which is prudence. How about just some good old-fashioned prudence? How about if our governing philosophy is not just a 5-point manifesto that you can write out on the back of a napkin, and now this is going to be our ideology? What if we just look, heaven forfend, to the past? What if we look to the things that have led to flourishing in our country and in our broader civilization? What if we look to the great thinkers and statesmen and see the wonderful developments that occurred along the way? And what if we modestly attempt to bring some of those ideas back? The reason I think the porn debate is such a hot issue when we talk about how to return to a substantive conservatism is that it's so easy, it's so modest. Just a dozen years ago, the federal government jailed a pornographer for almost 4 years just for obscenity. He hadn't committed an assault on his set. I don't think he had child pornography. It was merely the enforcement of obscenity laws. In the 1990s, the Republican House with the Democrat Senate and the Democrat President signed the Communications Decency Act. That's now what we talk about the CDA when it relates to big tech censorship. But the central point of the Communications Decency Act was to stop indecency on the internet. And unfortunately, the courts gutted the central provision of that law. Around the same time, the Republican House and the Democrat Senate and President passed the Child Online Protection Act that went further. It didn't just go after indecent content, it went after content that appealed to the prurient interest. This was not very long ago. This is something like 20 years ago. And there was widespread public support that our lunatic courts decided to gut based on some preposterous misreading of American history and the Constitution. But I do think the support would be there. So if we can just go that little step and say, thank you, Justice Potter, we can know it when we see it, and we are going to limit the spread of this indecent prurient material, I think that might give us a bit of our confidence back that we can know things, we can know a little bit about good and bad and right and wrong, and it is perfectly just and legitimate and actually necessary to enforce those standards in society.
As soon as you say that, people are going to say, well, fine, these are Christian standards. Are you afraid of that? I mean, does that bother you to say, yes, indeed? I mean, you're trying to impose your communist standards on what it is I'm allowed to say, and that's where you've mentioned the Taliban jokingly, and you've mentioned the integralists. I don't know, half jokingly, but I think a lot of the discomfort is actually just getting over the hump of saying, yes, the Bible, scriptural tradition, Christianity, that is the foundation of our civilization here in America and throughout the West. And if we're not going to defend that, we're not going to be around anymore. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. When people say, but Michael, you're suggesting a Christian standard, I would say, damned right I'm suggesting a Christian standard, that this was the standard that animated our civilization and certainly animated our country. Let's not forget the country began when pilgrims came to the shores. This country began when men who were broadly Christian in 1776 decided to form a new sort of government that was built in many ways on the existing colonial government. And all of them talked about how it was, in many ways, a Christian country. The argument that you'll see the left sometimes make is they'll say, no, Michael, America is not a Christian country because John Adams signed the Treaty of Tripoli, which said that America is not a Christian country. And so first of all, John Adams didn't write the Treaty of Tripoli. It was actually written by a Jeffersonian Republican. But second of all, John Adams signed that because Muslim pirates were kidnapping our sailors and disrupting our trade, and we just had to sort of make peace with these guys. But John Adams also said that America is built on Christian morality, that they are synonymous. And even John Adams, who may have been more deistic than some of the other founding fathers, had great respect for the values that come out of Christianity. And so, yes, that's what we're doing. I think very often now, going back to the Taliban, as it seems that we must do that these days, people think that the problem with the Taliban is that they are imposing standards and a vision on society. All societies do that. All regimes do that. All states have some standards and some vision. The problem with the Taliban is they get some things wrong. The problem with the Taliban is the substance of what they're doing in some cases. And so I just think if we could move past this sort of sophomoric debate over whether or not we're allowed to make any claims about the world and how we ought to live, and move into what is the more interesting matter that we used to debate as a society, which is, how should we live? What would be good for us and our communities and our country? I think that's at least the first step to returning to self-government.
The minimum step for returning to self-government, you're saying, is that we have to say, yes, our government is going to decide broadly what the common good is for. That's the reason we elect them. If we don't think they're coming to the right answers, then we vote them out.
Right.
But we ourselves, we have to say, yes, that's your job as an elected representative, is to look for the general welfare and the common good of this nation. That's what they're there for.
You know, there are conservatives who have told me that the very phrase, the common good, is an evil phrase. It's terrible. It's completely out of keeping with the American tradition and the American Republic. I, of course, at that point suggest that they look up the definition of the word republic and the etymology of the word republic, which talks about the things that we have in common that we're all doing together. And you know, a lot of this, I think, does owe to this very shallow ideology that was probably most popularized by Ayn Rand in the 20th century, but others as well. This idea that the highest good is just pursuing your own selfish interest, defined however difficult, with whatever difficulty that can be. And there's been a confusion among conservatives that the founding fathers of America are actually Austrian economists and a Russian emigre novelist who wrote cheap paperbacks, when in fact the founding fathers are George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, who had very different views than what came to masquerade as conservatism in the later 20th century.
Okay, so we've been talking around the fall of Afghanistan this week, and might as well hear from you what your thinking is on this. Some people are saying, look, this is the end of American empire and it's a tragedy, and some people are saying it's the end of American empire and good riddance. Where do you fall on this spectrum?
I think most people don't want to even admit that it was an episode of American empire, and I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes from. I think among the ruling class, one of the reactions to the fall of Kabul is that, by golly, now we'll never get a pride parade in the streets of Kandahar, and isn't that awful? You know, what the question that one first must confront is, what were we doing in Afghanistan? If the purpose of the occupation of Afghanistan, which, by the way, we didn't even really want to call it an occupation. Was it a war? Was it an occupation? Was it a police action? It was. I think we just referred to it as a military intervention, whatever that is supposed to mean. If the purpose of it was to give the United States a strategic location whereby, from which we could kill terrorists and halt the ambitions, say, of China or Russia, and we've got a nice territory in Central Asia. I think they could have made some argument for the ruling class's ultimate goal of just occupying that perpetually as an imperial territory. But they never made that argument. In fact, the definition that George Bush gave, and George W. Bush in 2005 for the mission in Afghanistan, was that the toppling of any regime that did not resemble a Madisonian democracy was not only an ideal to be pursued by the United States, which is a pretty radical ideal, especially from a Republican president, but further, that it was of urgent national security interest, that now it was any regime in the world that was not a Madisonian democracy posed an existential threat to the American homeland, which was a preposterous claim on its face. Nobody thinks that some strong man in South America is really posing an existential threat to the country or anywhere else for that matter. But it was a liberal justification for these adventures of empire abroad. Then it became nation building, which, it took the English 700 years to democratize. Maybe if the Afghans can keep up somewhere on that pace, that means we're going to be in Afghanistan for 800 years, 900 years. That's quite a commitment to make for a country that's 200 years old, 200 some odd years old. And so then the question became, okay, we're there to what? To spread liberal values through universities and allow women to study underwater basket weaving at Kabul U or something. It was so misdefined. And so now I think what the American people have said is that they want to be a nation. They don't want to be an empire. They certainly don't want to be a liberal empire where the whole point is to spread Drag Queen Story Hour to Kabul or something. And the ruling class doesn't want to allow the American people to be a nation once more. It doesn't want to allow the American people to save $2.5 trillion on this sort of overseas adventurism. But the problem for the ruling class is they can't explain even what they want to do as an empire. So I think sadly, it's sad to see these images out of Afghanistan, but it seems that it was ever thus.
If you take a look at the reactions of people online, it seems to me that the central point that people are fixating on is the women of Afghanistan. Right? There's this constant drumbeat of, look, it's crazy for the United States and Britain to pull troops out, because don't you understand that women are badly treated in Afghanistan? I don't want to deny that. I'm sure that lots of women are badly treated in Afghanistan. But it's kind of stunning to see the way in which the American troop presence in Afghanistan has transformed itself over time from a struggle against terror into a struggle for women's rights. Right. And this is look, Drag Queen Story Hour has its is a powerful image, but I think that you can better capture what's happening if you say there really are many people who who may be both in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and their parallel numbers in Europe, who find it inconceivable to think that there is a place on Earth where where the traditional political system is abusive to women. Now, I think that's a completely legitimate thing to feel and to think. But I find it really difficult to understand. Like, what is this principle that everywhere that women or some other group are being abused in the world, there your troops have to be?
Yes. You've seen a transformation of the United States from a shining city on a hill to the airborne divisions coming in and parachuting on to put shining cities on every hill all over the world, whether it's in Kandahar or whether it's in Africa or where Iraq or Syria or wherever else that would be. And that's a radical redefinition of what the country is and what the country is doing. Women are poorly treated in many parts of Afghanistan, sure. I suspect that's also true in Pakistan. I suspect that's also true in parts of India. I know that's true in China. So what is the limiting principle? There is none. And this does tie in with the hubris of liberalism, which is that, yes, there are problems in Afghanistan and elsewhere. There are problems in our own country. Let's not forget that leftist militants tried to burn the country down last year, and they did it for about 8 months. Let's not forget that we haven't been able to conduct a presidential election with seriousness and with people of all sides agreeing that it was legitimate in quite some time now. And actually the problems go back at least to the year 2000, and they go back probably further than that. And even on the point of women's happiness, let's not forget that for the past 50 years, inasmuch as one can measure happiness, you have seen declining woman happiness in the United States, both in relative terms to men, but also in absolute terms, as progressivism and liberalism have advanced. And so I'm not drawing a comparison between the liberal regime in America and the Taliban. I'm not comparing the two in terms of their treatment of women, but I am pointing out that when the liberal regime at home focuses all of its tension abroad, it seems to neglect the problems that are going on here. And probably we would do well to try to, before we make sure that elections are fair and free and everyone can agree to them in Kabul, maybe we should make sure that our own elections are fair and free and that we can have some faith in them. And maybe we should make sure that we've got our own house in order before we go fixing everyone else's problems.
I'm sure lots of people hear you say that, and that their immediate reaction is that that's not a fair comparison. But, I think people in other countries really do look at the fact that at least, as you say, at least the last 2 presidential elections in the United States have been broadly contested. We had one Republican who was rejected as a legitimate winner by many Democrats, and now a Democrat rejected as the legitimate winner by many Republicans. And this is the kind of thing that happens in a non-functioning democracy. This is the kind of thing that if it keeps going, it leads one side or the other to resort to violence in order to settle things.
And don't forget, yes, broad portions of Republicans and Democrats disputed the election results, but so did the vanquished candidates. In 2016, Hillary Clinton, I believe even today, Hillary Clinton still maintains that the election was a fraud and she should have been the legitimate winner. And of course, Donald Trump is doing that right now with many, many public shenanigans during 2020 because of the election integrity rules pertaining to, or the lack thereof, pertaining to COVID-19. So this is a problem not even just among people in various pockets of the country. Even within the ruling class, even within the people who are running in these elections, they are denying the legitimacy of the process.
There used to be a pop song like from the 70s. He can't even run his own life. I'll be damned if he'll run mine.
Yeah.
That's almost a motto of opposition to the United States right now.
Yeah.
Anyway, something I think really needs to be taken into account, that when you go to different places in the world, what you think about the people living there is not sufficient to understand the situation. You also have to understand what they think about what's going on with you.
Right.
As you said, Americans, God bless America, Americans really have some problems that need to be taken care of, and all the democracies are going to suffer real bad if America can't lick those things.
And there's an existential problem as well. I mean, yes, there's rioting in the streets. Yes, BLM is burning buildings. Yes, there's the Capitol incident and all these sorts of things. We also have a dying population. We are not replacing ourselves in the United States and in the West more broadly. That seems to be a problem in the long run. Our population, even before the coronavirus, was dying in terms of life expectancy. Life expectancy was decreasing in what is supposed to be the most flourishing country on earth. That seems to be a very serious problem that we should be able to confront. And even when we get to this question of should we be promoting our culture abroad, should we be expanding empire abroad, I guess there's the formal question of do we want an empire or not, but then there's the substantive question, what are we promoting? If we were promoting the glories of our civilization and spreading the wonders of Christendom throughout the world, I suppose that would be one thing. But if all we're promoting is this kind of vague regime of human rights, if we're promoting abortion, for instance, as we're doing throughout Africa, if we're promoting all this sort of madness, Is that worth it? I mean, even just at the substantive level, is that the kind of empire that people want to have? I don't think so.
Let's shift gears and talk a little bit about you. I know that you and Alyssa had your first child, a son, just in the last few months, right?
Yes, the sweet little bundle of joy and occasional terrorist is 7 months old. It's really wonderful. I'm hoping now at 7 months. I don't know what the cutoff is for Irish twins, but I really hope that we can get started. You know, I've got to catch up a little bit. If I'm going to have a brood of little Knowleses, then we've really got to get cracking.
How old are you?
So I'm 31, and I will say not to have too much information or anything, but we got married. By millennial standards, we were married as children. You know, I had a child bride because we were 28. But by historical standards, we're a little bit older to be getting married. And so we had to catch up. And I will say we are Catholic. And so the Catholics, they get started on making babies pretty quickly. You know, you just that's what you do. You have a big Catholic family. And in our case, it didn't happen right away. And the medical interventions that you can take if you're Catholic are limited, and they're prescribed by bioethical concerns, and you can't, for instance, use IVF or other measures that are contrary to the Church's teaching. And so, fortunately, more modest interventions, easy enough. We have our wonderful son. But it does make me worry a little bit for some of my friends who they're millennials. They'll put off getting married until they're in their 30s. And many of them will push off having children until they're in their late 30s, some of them even early 40s. And they think it's just going to happen and it won't be a big deal. And it doesn't always just happen. And you're seeing story after story of regret for people who say, gosh, I bought into this idea that I just needed to ruthlessly pursue my career until I was in my late 30s, and then I could settle down and have a family, and now I'm regretting it because that opportunity is not available to me. I think you're going to see a lot more young people coming to grips with the disparity between what they were promised and the reality.
Why have children? So if you're a nationalist and you really care about the future of your nation, then you might say, well, I want to have a lot of children because I want to strengthen my country. I mean, I know that may sound strange to a lot of people, but in a place like Israel, there's plenty of countries in the world where there still are people who say, I want to have a lot of children because I want there to be a next generation for the sake of my country and my heritage. If you're religious, then it becomes a religious commandment. Yeah. To be fruitful and multiply is the first thing that God wants from human beings. And the question is whether, how can you expect people to set aside, the glories of their career, yeah. Career. The word career is like military campaign. It's like the medals that they're going to win by by working for consulting firms. Yeah. So we're saying that we want people to set that aside, to get married early and have a lot of kids. But if they're not going to be personally religious and they're not going to be nationalists, it's not clear what's the motive for doing it? Why should they do it?
Right. This reminds me, we were criticizing Ayn Rand a little earlier, and one of the glaring features of Ayn Rand's books is that there aren't really any kids. So this ideology that has animated a lot of people on the left and on the right for the past many decades now is one that really excludes children. And then, to be fair to the people who are putting off having kids, there are also economic and political factors here, which is that the economy is no longer built to sustain a family with one income. Now, both parents seem obligated to go work, and childcare is very expensive. So in many cases, you have a man paying a woman to raise his children so that his wife can go work for another man at the consulting firm or the widget factory. That seems a little inefficient. That seems a little backwards as well. And our society seems oriented in that way. And so, as we say, laws and ideas are going to have consequences, and as we have transformed the society in that direction, we have discouraged people from settling down and having kids. Certainly you see this in the case of no-fault divorce. It was once understood that a marriage is not just a private act that you have because you love somebody, but it's a public act. You're making a vow, you're making a promise to your community, and you're making a vow to God. This is an open political act, and when you break that, that causes scandal, and you had to prove that there was some pressing reason that you ought to be able to break that. And with the advent of no-fault divorce, well, that idea went out the window. And the idea that you have any obligation to your community or your state or your country or your God really went out the window as well. And so you see a lot of entitlement talk on the left, but you see a lot of entitlement talk on the right as well, and very little talk about duty and obligation and loyalty and virtue. And so when that goes, then, as you say, it's very difficult to come up with this rationalist description of why one should have children. Even though those of us who have had kids can say, it's the greatest, it's wonderful, it's fabulous, it's what we ought to do, and it's what everyone else ought to at least try to do as well.
How did you come by your Catholicism? Did you grow up within the house?
I came by it the hard way. So I grew up with it. I was a cradle Catholic, baptized, had the sacraments. We took it somewhat seriously, depending on the season, depending on the year, but never all too seriously. And by the time I was 13, this coincided with some of the church scandals, but it also coincided with that publishing movement of the new atheists, Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins and all them. I described myself as a firm atheist. I think all of those atheist books were really good at appealing to 13-year-old boys. That was the target audience, and I remained that way for about a decade. And my reversion, in short, is that I was confronted when I was a freshman with a roommate, coincidentally or providentially, you might say. He introduced me to some of the arguments for the existence of God, although he was somewhat agnostic himself. But the ontological argument I found persuasive, even though many people do not. And obviously the many other arguments for God. I then read C.S. Lewis, then I encountered G.K. Chesterton, and then only after the intellectual ascent had taken place, because I was such a prideful little jerk, only after I could get over the intellectual hump, then did the sort of religious experience take over. And by about 23, I reverted to the church. Coincidentally, at the Church of St. Michael. Father George Rutler was very influential in that. And now I'm firmly convinced. But I took the long road. I wouldn't recommend, I'd say if you can take the shorter road, that's a good way to do it too.
What do you say to, there must be 100 million people or more in the United States and Europe who are in this position of thinking that, maybe there's something to religion, but I'll never get there. What do you have to say to them?
Well, Douglas Murray, I think, articulates this quite well when he calls himself a Christian atheist. Now, of course, you can't be a Christian atheist, but what he's saying is, I think it's good, I think people should do it, but I myself cannot believe. And I would remind people that we are incarnate beings, and the faith that we're talking about is an incarnate faith. Judaism is an incarnate faith, right? There is a people, there is a nation of Israel, and Christianity, obviously in the sacraments, is an incarnate faith. Christ himself is the second person of the Trinity in flesh and blood, fully human and fully God in the hypostatic union. And the sacraments, when Christ says this wafer, this bread is my body, this is my blood, it is an acknowledgement and a promise that the physical and the metaphysical do come together every so often, and that human beings need the regular coming together of the physical and the metaphysical, of the symbol and the symbolized. They have to do that because we are not just meat puppets, as the materialists would tell us we are. We are not just disembodied souls, as for instance, the transgenderists and other Gnostics would tell us that we are. We're both. Our body and our soul and our spirit are inextricably linked while we're here on earth. And so I would encourage them to just try it out. Not just think about it, but actually try praying. Try attending a liturgy. Try praying on your knees. Try looking at the physical world and recognizing the semiotic richness of it. recognizing that symbols do point to other things, and then doing it yourself. It's the same thing with virtue. People will write in, because this idea of virtue seems to have been forgotten in our modern age, and they'll say, Michael, I want to stop drinking so much, or doing drugs, or looking at porn, or whatever, but I can't get how do I do it? How do I just convince myself to? I say, you just do it. I know, I mean, we're locked in this world where we're told that it's sort of the steam engine view, the Freud view of the mind, that, we just can't repress anything. We got to let off a little steam every once in a while. But that's not how virtue really works. Virtue is, if you practice it, it is a habit, and it becomes easier and easier and easier. And the same is true of vice. Vice is a habit, and the more you do it, the harder it's going to be not to do it. And so I just think, try putting it in your body a little bit. Try getting on your knees. Try attending the liturgy. My friend Andrew Clavin says that if you want to find God, just act for 60 days as if God exists. Just take this leap, this thought experiment, and act as though God exists. And I think you'll find that he does.
Michael Knowles, terrific to have you on. And I look forward to seeing you at NatCon 2 in Orlando, not very long from now.
Yoram, the pleasure is all mine. Very much looking forward to it.